A Marine's oath once sworn on foreign soil was reborn on a roadside in Oregon. Jack Turner carried 3 poisoned dogs from the edge of death into a fight against the men who discarded them. From a warehouse full of cages to a courthouse heavy with truth, his battle stretched beyond war memories into something greater hope. And from a small cabin on the bluff grew the harbor of hope. Want the full story of betrayal, loyalty, and healing? Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. The morning held its breath the way small coastal towns do before the sun decides whether it wants to show up. Jack Turner laced his running shoes on the porch of his rented cabin high enough on the bluff to smell the tide flats and the faint iron of wet rails from the freight spur below. He was 36 and looked at lean, quiet-eyed, careful with motion. Sleep had stepped out on him years ago, so he ran. The rhythm gave him something to lean on, left, right, inhale again. A thin rain stitched the air, not enough to drive anyone inside, just enough to make the pines shine. He set off down the gravel past mailboxes with peeling paint and a diner sign that forgot the letter E down toward the 2-lane that curved like a knuckle around a marsh. A gull scolded nothing in particular. Joggers in bright jackets came this way on weekends. Monday was for men like Jack people who kept their thoughts flat as the road and let the body do the talking. He took the shoulder, listening the way his old sergeant had taught him first to his breath, then to what lived outside it. The river lay out there behind the reed beds, making the sort of noise only rivers make when they want to be ignored. He had covered a mile when the wind shifted, and a smell came at him thin and wrong. Not rot, not salt. Something sharp that had once promised clean on a label and then soured into something else. He slowed without meaning to herd his footfalls turn from rhythm to test. Ahead, the pullout that locals used to watch storms was empty except for a tipped trash barrel and 3 black shapes huddled against the guardrail. It would have been easy to call them bags and keep going. He had already learned what keep going costs. He stopped. The rain made a fine white noise on everything. He walked in palms out the way you approach a dog you don't know, though there were no dogs. Not yet. The first bag twitched. Not wind. Not an animal scuffling outside. Something inside a small, miserable shift. Jack's chest tightened with a memory that had no photograph chrome light bouncing off a blast wall, a voice calling a name that didn't belong to him anymore. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the plastic. Heat bled through. He didn't talk at first. He looked at the clumsy knot, the quick, careless twist used to tie yard debris, at the slick sheen where rain had done its best to turn poison into patience and failed. He had a pocket knife. It was short and dull from coil-cutting jobs around the marina, but it would do. He slid the blade under the knot and made a neat tear. The bag opened with the sigh a room gives when you turn a key. A face watched him. German Shepherd male by the shape of the head sable coat matted into a half mask, eyes the brown of old coffee. The dog's chest worked like a bellows with a seam split. He made no sound, only drew in air and let it go a shiver running the length of his body every third breath, as if some invisible hand had tapped a wire. Bones stood out along his ribs, not like an athlete's, but like a map of absence. Jack slid his hands under the dog's shoulders and eased him onto the wet gravel. The animal's weight surprised him the way a pack gets heavier at hour 3 mass that doesn't ask your permission. "Easy," Jack said, "because you say something when your hands are full of living." He peeled the plastic back and set it aside carefully. Rain can clean and it can hide. He moved to the second bag. It jumped at his touch and then went still, the sort of fear that shuts off lights to make the house look empty. He cut the knot slower this time because the plastic had drawn tight and he did not want to nick what should not be nicked. A Doberman slid into the world on her side, sleek but scabbed tendons too visible along her legs. Her eyes were dark coins wide enough to reflect a man and decide later if that mattered. When she tried to stand, Her body trembled out of sequence, a violin string tuned to the wrong note. Jack steadied her with one palm and let her set her feet herself. She folded again, breathing small and fast. The smell struck him strongest here, a chemical, solvent, sharp, something you might find under a sink or in a garage that doesn't care about labels. He wanted to take the smell out of the air with his hands. He couldn't. The third bag did not move. He knew better than to make the mistake of wanting it not to. He cut quick and clean, and the weight came heavy, square, a Rottweiler male, big through the chest even now. His gums were the wrong shade tongue, dry as paper. He was breathing on habit, not conviction. Jack knelt in the rain and placed 2 fingers against the dog's neck where a pulse ought to live. It lived stubborn and thin. Somewhere behind him, a pickup passed, tires whispering on wet asphalt. He could have flagged it down. He didn't. The road here was a long, straight sentence. Help would not come in time by accident. He shrugged out of his hoodie and spread it over the Doberman, then tugged his damp long sleeve down to pad the shepherd's flank where the plastic had stuck. It wasn't the warmth that mattered most. It was the signal. You are not trash, but intention doesn't move a body. He stood and scanned the shoulder. His truck sat half a mile back at the trailhead where he liked to pretend the world began. He measured the distance, the weight, the time for lungs that had decided to argue. He shifted the Shepherd Max, he said, without meaning to, because the mouth grabs a name when it needs a handle, and lifted. The dog's head fell against his forearm. The rain made sheets out of the air, but he could see the white of the center line and the dark run of the shoulder. He walked. Gravel crunched. Then water sang in his shoes. Then the world became the count inside his skull. At the trailhead, he set Max gently on the passenger seat, cracked the window, and wiped his palms on his jeans, the way mechanics do before a second job. He jogged back. The Doberman had managed to sit, shoulders shaking, eyes fixed on the place where he had gone, as if the earth might open up and swallow what it wanted most. Shadow, he heard himself say, placing his hands in her view before touching her chest. She let him lift. She weighed less than she looked the way regret does. He worked slower on the second carry legs, arguing breath, steadying around words he didn't say. At the truck, he set her on the floorboard, tucked the hoodie around her like a piece of night that could be told to stay put, and ran again. The Rottweiler was where he had left him, but the breath had gone shallower. Jack crouched, curled an arm under the dog's shoulders, another under his hips, and lifted in a controlled roll to save his own back. The dog's head lolled against his chest. For a second, the size of a match flame, he felt the old helicopter wind hot dust, slapping teeth. Someone yelling coordinates that never made sense in time. He blinked it down. Bear, he said, because the weight needed a word. On the third carry his thighs burned, and his knees told him they were not recruits. He let the burn argue. He set Bear into the truck bed he had lined with a moving blanket months earlier for a job that hadn't come through, then ran a loop of rope through the side ring and around the dog's middle. Not tight, just enough to keep him from rolling if the road insisted on a mistake. He climbed in, started the engine, and turned the heater up until it blew something like sincerity. The nearest vet sat 3 miles along the harbor road, a flat cinder-block building, indifferent to weather. He checked the mirror, Max on the seat, eyes half-lidded. Shadow on the floor, chest rising like it had been taut, ears flicking when the turn signal ticked. Bear out back under the cap head, braced against the tailgate, eyes not quite closed. Jack pulled onto the highway and kept one hand high on the wheel, the other near the vent to feel the lukewarm air working. At the first stop sign, a man in a neon vest waved a slow traffic paddle. Jack eased through. The man glanced at the cab, blinked at the shepherd's face, then looked away the way people do when they realize they've stumbled onto something private. 2 blocks later, a school crossing sign flashed and a group of kids trailed a teacher like ducklings. Jack let them pass and tried not to imagine what it would do to Shadow if a horn blared now. He rolled through town without making the mistake of speed. The clinic's lot was more puddle than gravel. He backed in, set the brake, and let the truck idle while he checked pulses again, 1, 2, 3, counting the rise and fall under his fingers the way you count breathing when there's nothing else to count. Max's heartbeat tapped against his palm, a steady if fragile metronome. Shadow's breath came smaller, but more even than it had. Bear's chest lifted and dropped as if someone had wound him, then set the key aside. Jack cut the engine and listened to the sudden quiet rain ticking on the hood like a metronome set too slow. He drew a breath that had edges and opened the door. "You're okay," he told the air first, then the dogs, then himself. He stepped down and squared his shoulders, not for show but so his hands would know what to do. He didn't know yet who had done this, and he didn't know how far the road would go, but he knew the next step. He reached for the handle and pushed into the bright antiseptic light that meant the fight would start in earnest on the other side. Jack pushed the glass door open with his shoulder, the bell above it giving a meek jingle that seemed too small for the urgency in his arms. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant wet fur and the sweet tang of bubble gum from a jar near the counter. Behind the desk, a young technician looked up, her freckled face blanching as soon as she saw Max cradled against Jack's chest, foam streaking the shepherd's muzzle and ribs that lifted too fast. She dropped the clipboard she was holding and ran to swing the gate, calling sharply into the back. "Dr. Collins, we've got 3 critical." The words carried like an order, not a suggestion. Jack moved with her through the swinging door, the Doberman following unsteadily behind him, trembling but unwilling to collapse until she crossed into the light. Bear lay in the truck bed outside, so Jack spun on his heel, sprinted through the rain, and lifted the big Rottweiler once more, feeling the weight sag as if life itself had slipped halfway out of reach. He carried Bear and the dog's head heavy against his chest, and the clinic's back room brightened with motion. Dr. Collins, a woman in her 40s with jaw-length dark hair tucked behind one ear and slate-gray scrubs, stepped out of a side room, stethoscope swinging. She did not waste a heartbeat asking questions. Her eyes swept the 3 bodies, and her hands were already snapping on gloves. "Max to table 1, Shadow to table 2. Bear here with me," she commanded. The team moved like a drill. Fluids hung from poles. Oxygen masks slid into place and activated. Charcoal was drawn into syringes, black slurry that promised to fight what poison still lingered inside. Jack held Max's head still while the muzzle was gently strapped, felt the dog's shallow breaths flutter against his palm. Across the room, Shadow whimpered as a catheter slipped into her foreleg, her wide eyes darting between every hand, every voice, until one of the techs murmured and steadied her breathing with a careful rhythm. At the far table, Bear did not respond at all. Dr. Collins pressed fingers into his gums, checked his pupils, and began chest compressions with measured force. The monitor that had just been clipped to his tongue gave a flat, merciless tone, one long, unbroken sound that silenced the room. Jack froze, a cold grip closing in his chest, the memory of dust and rotor blades snapping at him without permission. He could see another body, another weight in his arms somewhere else, some years ago, and the voice of his sergeant saying, "Steady, steady, steady." He moved without thinking, placing his hand on Bear's shoulder, not pushing, not taking over, just grounding the effort. "Doctor." Collins reached for the pre-drawn syringe of antidote, pressed it into the catheter, and nodded to her assistant to keep oxygen flowing with the ambu bag. The seconds stretched, the flat tone hammering into every rib in the room. Jack whispered, "Stay with me." His voice steady, not pleading, just laying a line for the dog's failing heart to follow. Then the monitor stuttered. One blip, then another, uneven, fragile, but there. The Rottweiler's chest shuddered with a breath that sounded torn from the bottom of a well. Dr. Collins did not smile, did not waste the moment with celebration. She leaned in, checked the airway, adjusted the oxygen, and said simply, "We've got him back. Keep hands steady." The room let out a collective breath, but no one stopped working. Max's tremors began to ease as fluids pushed strength back into his veins. Shadow's eyes softened. Her muscles no longer pulled taut by invisible wire, though she still tracked every motion like a soldier unwilling to trust ceasefire. Bear lay still, a massive frame cocooned in tubes and blankets, his chest rising with mechanical rhythm, but alive. Jack stood with his sleeves rolled up, damp from rain and sweat, his hands still gripping where he had been told to grip, and in his throat lived a gratitude so heavy it felt dangerous to speak. Dr. Collins finally turned to him, her eyes sharp but kind. "You got them here in time," she said, as if confirming a fact the universe had been arguing. Then she lowered her voice, drawing him aside while the technicians settled into the slow work of monitoring vitals. "Mr. Turner, these dogs aren't strays," she said quietly. "Their conditions, the chemical traces, the restraint marks on their legs. This isn't random cruelty. Someone owned them. Someone used them. And then someone decided they weren't worth keeping." Jack's scar burned faintly near his temple, the thin seam of old battlefield lessons waking in him. He looked back at Max's steadying chest. Shadow's tentative breaths, Bear's stubborn pulse, and he understood something heavier than the rain outside. These animals were not discarded trash. They were evidence-abandoned witnesses to a story darker than he had yet imagined. He nodded once, not a gesture of agreement, but of recognition, as if locking the doctor's words into his own private archive. Outside, the drizzle thickened, drumming on the cinder-block walls, a sound like distant applause. Jack knew the battle had only begun. Jack Turner drove the 3 dogs home after 2 days of intensive care at the clinic, the cab filled with the quiet rhythm of shallow breathing and the occasional clink of metal tags newly fastened to their collars. Dr. Collins had stabilized them and sent him off with instructions medications and the kind of look that held more questions than words, but Jack knew this was only the beginning. The road wound along the bluff until his small cabin appeared its wood siding, damp from the mist, a single porch light casting a cone across the gravel. He parked the truck and carried Bear, first the Rottweiler, heavier, now not because of his frame, but because of the fragile trust wrapped inside his still recovering body. Max the shepherd walked stiffly by Jack's side, his eyes alert to every sound in the trees. Shadow the Doberman hung back, her paws slow on the gravel as though every step weighed twice what it should. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee familiar to Jack, but alien to them. He laid out blankets near the fireplace, set bowls of water and food, and sat on the floor to wait. Max sniffed, paced a circle, then finally lay down with his head high, ears pricked at the smallest creak of wood. Shadow retreated into the corner beneath the window, pressing her body low, shivering at the groan of a passing logging truck on the highway below. Bear sank down heavily, but refused the food bowl, his eyes closing in exhaustion. Jack did not rush them. He removed his boots quietly, his hat placed on the peg by the door, but even that simple act stirred reaction. When he reached for the hat later, Max's growl rolled low, the sound of an animal who had once learned to fear the shape of men in uniform. Jack froze, set the hat aside without a word, and allowed silence to mend what command might break. The first evening passed with water bowls touched, but food untouched, the smell of kibble mixing with the scent of damp fur. Jack warmed soup for himself and sat at the table, the spoon against the bowl making a soft clink that made Shadow flinch. He set the spoon down and finished in silence, realizing sound itself was an enemy for them. By nightfall, the cabin seemed split into zones. Max watching the door, Shadow hiding against the wall, Bear curled but unmoving hunger, untouched by appetite. Jack stretched on the couch with the old quilt pulled up the rhythm of his breath, steady, letting them hear without pressure that sleep could be simple here. At midnight, the rain thickened, tapping the tin roof, and somewhere in the dark the world shifted. Jack woke not to sound but to motion. A shadow crossed his arm, and before his eyes opened fully, teeth found flesh. Shadow had lunged eyes wide with terror, jaws snapping onto his forearm. Pain bloomed sharp immediate, but Jack did not jerk away. He stilled his body muscles quiet, voice low saying, "Only, easy girl, easy." The Doberman's eyes held no malice, only the wild panic of memory repeating itself. Her teeth pressed hard enough to draw blood, but Jack kept his arm steady, his other hand open, palm up, showing there was no strike to come. Seconds passed like miles. The dog's breathing rag at her body, trembling, her grip loosened. She released and stumbled backward, panting her body low to the ground, eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting punishment. Jack sat up slowly, wrapped a towel around his arm, and said nothing. His gaze was steady, not angry, not fearful. He let her see that pain had not changed the shape of his patience. Shadow lowered her head, ears pinned her body, folding in on itself. Max rose from his spot tail, stiff, ready to defend, but Jack lifted his hand slightly. A quiet signal learned long ago, hold, wait. Bear stirred heavy eyes opening, but no strength yet to move. Jack leaned back against the couch, his wound throbbing but his voice calm. "You're safe," he said into the quiet, more for her than for himself. He did not reach out, did not chase her, only allowed the space to hold both fear and forgiveness at once. The rest of the night passed in uneasy rhythm. But when dawn filtered through the blinds, Jack found Shadow a foot closer to the couch. Her body curled, but her eyes fixed on him as if testing whether the man who had taken the bite still offered the same stillness. He rose, carefully cleaned the wound in the sink, and pulled on a fresh shirt. He set fresh bowls of food again. This time Bear lifted his head, sniffed, and took a slow mouthful, a small victory. Max followed, eating cautiously while Shadow lingered, then stepped forward to sip water, her ribs shifting under her skin like fragile branches in wind. Jack exhaled and let the morning hold its own fragile promise. He knew the war here would not be fought in days, but in months, maybe years, and he was willing. Jack Turner carried the days carefully, as if each one might split if handled too roughly. He rose before dawn, set out the bowls, checked the medications lined neatly in a row, and spoke quietly while the dogs adjusted to the strange rhythm of a house that asked nothing from them except to breathe. Max grew more comfortable first, patrolling the cabin like a soldier checking perimeters, lying by the door with eyes half closed but ears ready. Bear's strength returned slowly. He moved from blanket to porch, soaking sun on his black coat, eating more with each passing day. Shadow was slower to trust, always glancing over her shoulder, but she began to follow Jack from room to room at a distance, her paws soundless on the floorboards. Jack did not force progress. He let trust arrive the way rain seeps into dry earth slowly, until one morning he noticed Shadow was close enough to brush against his leg when he bent to set down her dish. He said nothing, only let the moment stand. Nights remained difficult. Jack carried his own shadows, and sometimes the roar of distant freight trains through the valley pried open memories he could not lock away. The dogs stirred at his unrest. One night, in the grip of a dream, he thrashed against an invisible enemy, breath-ragged chest tight as if pinned beneath the desert sun again. He woke not to silence, but to wait. Max, the shepherd, had climbed onto the couch and pressed his body across Jack's chest. The dog's head rested near his neck, eyes steady, his heartbeat a firm rhythm against Jack's own racing pulse. For a moment Jack could not breathe, not from panic, but from the sudden tether of presence. He lifted a hand and laid it against the dog's back, feeling fur warm under his palm. The storm inside eased, the noise dimmed, and the nightmare receded. Jack whispered a wordless thanks, and Max stayed until dawn, his steady weight serving as anchor each time Jack drifted toward darkness. The following mornings Jack noticed changes. Bear began sleeping closer to his bed rather than the far wall. Shadow barked once, sharp and surprising, when a delivery truck pulled too close to the drive, her body planted firmly, as if to say no harm would cross the threshold without her notice. The house, once silent and wary, began to sound like a home nails clicking against wood bowls, clinking the thump of tails against the floor when Jack entered the room. One evening, as Jack returned from splitting wood behind the cabin, he saw something unusual on the porch. A folded piece of paper, weighted by a small, smooth stone, rested against the doorframe. He crouched, lifted it carefully, and unfolded the page. The handwriting was uneven, large letters pressed hard into the paper with a dull pencil. It read, "Thank you for saving them. They needed you." No name, no address, just those words. Jack stood on the porch, the sky painted with the fading light of late afternoon, and felt the stillness gather around him. Someone knew. The story had slipped beyond these four walls. A child had written this. He could see it in the earnest scrawl, in the way the words leaned forward as if trying to run faster than the hand could guide them. He looked out toward the town below, houses scattered along the harbor road, smoke rising from chimneys. Somewhere down there, a child had heard and cared enough to leave gratitude at his door. Jack folded the note carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, not to display, but to keep. It was proof that what he had carried from the roadside was no longer just his burden. The next days carried a subtle difference. When Jack went to the hardware store for feed and supplies, the cashier gave a small nod that lingered longer than usual. At the diner, someone paid for his coffee before he reached the counter. He did not seek attention, but the current had shifted. The rescue was no longer unseen. Jack returned to his cabin with the knowledge that his private war had begun to ripple outward. That evening he sat on the porch with Bear leaning against his leg. Max stretched near the steps, and Shadow settled cautiously at his feet. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, the harbor below hushed by the setting sun. He reached into his pocket, touched the folded note, and realized the line between his solitude and the town was thinner now. He was no longer just a man with 3 dogs. He was part of a story that others had begun to tell. The note from the child remained in Jack's jacket pocket like a quiet reminder, and days in the cabin began to find rhythm, feeding at sunrise, long walks along the gravel road, evenings on the porch with the dogs nearby. Max carried himself with the steady posture of a sentinel. Bear lumbered with more strength each week, and Shadow moved lightly but still scanned every shadow as though the world might collapse without warning. Jack decided that it was time to walk them through town, to let them know that the world outside the cabin was not only threat, but also part of their new life. He clipped the leashes and headed down the winding road toward the harbor, the mist lifting to reveal storefronts with painted signs, fishing boats rocking against the pier, and townsfolk moving through their morning routines. The dogs stayed close, Max leading with measured steps, Shadow hesitating at passing bicycles, Bear keeping pace with surprising calm. Jack greeted a shop owner with a nod, received a cautious smile in return, and for a moment believed that trust might grow here too. Then, as they passed the hardware store, everything shifted. Max stopped mid-stride, muscles tight, his entire body turning rigid as his ears pointed forward. A low growl built in his throat, not directed at the hiss of brakes from a truck, not at a dog across the street, but at a man walking on the sidewalk ahead. The man wore a dark jacket, his cap pulled low, his hands buried in pockets. He looked ordinary enough, yet Max's reaction was sharp, instinctive, not a learned fear, but the recognition of scent of memory written into nerves. Shadow's body dropped low, her hackles rising, a whimper pressed between her teeth while Bear rumbled deep in his chest. Jack tightened the leashes, his eyes narrowing on the stranger. The man paused, glanced their way, and in that brief moment Jack saw his jaw tighten, his shoulders stiffen, not with surprise but with discomfort, as if he had not expected to be remembered. He turned quickly, crossing the street without a word, and disappeared down the next block. Jack knelt, steadied Max with a firm hand, whispering reassurance, but his mind stayed fixed on the man's reaction. Dogs did not invent fear without reason. That evening, Jack could not shake the encounter. He sat at his table, the note from the child on the wood beside him, the dogs resting near the fire. The growl replayed in his mind the look on the man's face, and he knew it was not chance. The following day, needing supplies, Jack drove toward the edge of town. Passing the old mill road, he caught sight of the same man. He was standing near a warehouse, long abandoned, its siding warped windows, broken, the kind of building that had once housed industry, but now served only as backdrop for decay. The man was not passing by. He lingered near the loading bay, glancing around as if ensuring no one watched. Jack slowed his truck, careful not to draw attention, and noted details, the way the man checked his phone, the scuff of heavy boots, the nervous habit of pulling his cap lower, as though concealment might erase guilt. He did not approach, not yet, but his instincts stirred. This was no coincidence. He drove on, letting the dogs rest in the back, but his eyes stayed sharp on the mirror until the warehouse slipped out of sight. That night the cabin felt less like a refuge, and more like a post on the edge of unknown territory. Jack moved quietly through the rooms, checked the locks, and found Max already stationed near the door, ears pricked at every sound. Shadow paced before finally settling. Bear lay with his head heavy on his paws, but kept one eye open. Jack sat with them, hand resting on Max's back, and whispered, "You remember him, don't you?" The shepherd's ears flicked as if acknowledging the truth without words. Jack knew then that the past had not ended with rescue. The dogs carried history inside them, and now that history had walked by in broad daylight. And if that man stood near an abandoned warehouse, there was more buried there than dust and silence. Jack Turner did not sleep well after spotting the stranger near the abandoned warehouse. The image returned each time he closed his eyes, the way the man's shoulders tensed, the glance over his shoulder, the retreat into shadow. The dogs mirrored his unease. Max paced at the front door as if waiting for orders. Shadow circled restlessly, and Bear lay still but raised his head whenever gravel shifted on the road outside. Jack knew that avoiding the warehouse would solve nothing. The dogs had recognized something, and their memories were not easily fooled. On a gray morning, he loaded them into the truck and drove down the old mill road, the tires crunching over broken stone. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal siding streaked with rust, the wide loading bay door crooked on one hinge. Jack parked out of sight behind a line of cedar trees, clipped the leashes, and walked toward the building. The air smelled faintly of oil and something sharper beneath it. As they approached, Max pulled against the leash, his body low, ears forward. Shadow whined quietly, her tail tucked, while Bear moved with a heavy determination. Jack crouched near the loading bay and scanned the ground. The soil was disturbed, pressed with footprints that had not yet faded, and scattered across the gravel were pieces of chain, some links broken, others still caked with rust and hair. He bent closer and picked up a strand of coarse fur, dark and short, almost identical to Bear's. Nearby, a plastic barrel lay tipped on its side, the label peeled, but the chemical smell strong enough to sting his throat. He recognized the odor. It matched the sour trace that had clung to the dogs when he first cut them from the bags. He stepped inside the bay. The floor was littered with scraps of rope, fragments of wooden pallets, and stains that had sunk into the concrete. The dogs pulled toward a far corner where a pile of discarded feed bags lay heaped against the wall. Jack lifted one with the tip of his boot, revealing a scatter of bones and fur. His chest tightened. His breath measured not with surprise, but with confirmation of what he already feared. This place was not just abandoned. It had been used and used recently for cruelty that matched the scars his dogs carried. He pulled his phone from his pocket, snapping photographs of the chain, the barrel, the stained floor. As he straightened, a sound came from the side entrance, a door creaking open, footsteps quick and uneven. Jack turned sharply just as a man stepped into the light. They nearly collided, only a foot between them. The man froze his eyes, darting first to Jack, then to the three dogs straining at their leashes. For a heartbeat, no one moved, but then Max lunged, his growl rising deep. Shadow barking sharply, Bear's roar filling the cavernous space. The man's face drained of color. He stumbled backward, hands raised defensively, his breath sharp and fast. Jack saw recognition flash in Shadow's eyes, the same terror and fury she had shown on the night she bit his arm. She remembered him. The man cursed under his breath, turned and bolted through the side door, his boots slipping on the wet gravel outside. Jack tightened his grip on the leashes to hold the dogs back, though every muscle in their bodies strained to chase. He watched the figure disappear into the trees, noting the heavy jacket, the torn cap, the limp in his left leg. Jack exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. He had come looking for answers and found enough to know the fight was larger than 3 bags on a roadside. He stepped back into the warehouse, photographing everything once more, then guided the dogs out into the cold air. The forest held its silence, broken only by their steady breaths. Jack walked them back to the truck, his mind already working through the next steps. Evidence was here, real and undeniable. The dogs had reacted not with uncertainty but with recognition, and their truth was stronger than any word a stranger might deny. As he drove away, the warehouse receded in the mirror, but Jack felt it had not let him go. The dogs lay restless in the back, shifting and sighing, as if waiting for him to name what they all understood. The past had not ended, and whoever had hurt them was still close. Jack Turner drove home from the warehouse with photographs saved in his phone, the image of the man's pale face still vivid in his mind, and the dogs restless from the encounter. He spent that evening cleaning their paws, checking their water bowls and writing notes in a small spiral pad he had used during deployments, now repurposed as a record of what he had seen. The following morning he noticed movement outside his cabin. A pickup had stopped at the end of his drive, and a woman stepped out carrying a bag of dry food. She waved once, set it on the porch, and drove off without asking for thanks. Later that day, an older man from town arrived with a sack of firewood, saying only that he had heard Jack might need it. By the end of the week, others had begun to appear, a teenager offering to fix the loose porch railing, a pair of fishermen dropping off leftover catch, a woman from the diner leaving a basket of bread. Each gesture was quiet but intentional, a sign that word of his rescue and of the danger connected to it had spread. Not everyone approved. At the grocery store, a neighbor pulled Jack aside between aisles of canned goods and spoke in a hushed tone, warning that digging too deeply into other people's affairs might bring trouble no one wanted. At the gas station, another man muttered that some matters were better left alone, that the warehouse had been empty for years and should stay that way. Jack listened, nodded, but said little. He recognized fear when he heard it, the kind of fear born not from ignorance, but from knowing too much. Back at the cabin, the dogs sensed the tension. Max stayed closer to the door than ever. Shadow startled at new voices, Bear pressed against Jack's leg, as if to remind him that his loyalty would not shift. One evening, as Jack stacked wood, another vehicle approached. The man who stepped out moved with a soldier's bearing. His stance balanced, his gaze scanning before settling. He introduced himself as Mike Harris, a former Marine who had served as a K-9 handler overseas. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little since. He had heard about Jack and the dogs, and he wanted to help. At first, Jack measured him cautiously. Trust did not come quickly anymore. But when Max approached and sniffed without growling, when Shadow watched without retreating, when Bear gave a slow wag of his tail, Jack recognized the unspoken approval. Mike entered the cabin and sat at the table, his hands rough, his eyes steady. He told Jack that he had once trained dogs to detect explosives, that he had lost one in an ambush years ago, and that the memory still carried as if it had happened yesterday. He understood what it meant to rely on animals for survival and to feel responsible for their pain. Jack listened, recognizing pieces of his own reflection in the man's story. Mike studied the scars on the dogs, the way Shadow flinched at sudden sounds, the way Bear moved cautiously as if bracing for correction. He spoke softly, offering techniques to rebuild trust, to redirect fear into discipline, to give them new purpose beyond survival. Jack felt the room shift. For months he had carried this weight alone, guided only by instinct and patience. But now another veteran sat across from him, someone who knew not just the pain, but the language of dogs and of war. They walked the property together that evening, the dogs circling at their sides. Mike pointed out where a fence could be strengthened, how to build simple obstacles to retrain muscles and minds, how to give the animals tasks that anchored them to the present instead of the past. The work was practical, but beneath it lay something deeper, a kinship born from shared silence, from knowing what it meant to wake at night and reach for a presence that was not there. When Mike left, promising to return the next day with spare equipment he kept in his shed, Jack stood on the porch watching the taillights fade. He felt the line between isolation and connection shift again, this time stronger, heavier with both risk and hope. The town was no longer simply background. It had become divided ground, some standing behind him, others urging retreat. And now, beside him, another Marine with a past of his own had stepped forward, carrying both skill and sorrow ready to share the burden. The following week, Jack Turner and Mike Harris worked side by side, alternating between caring for the dogs and following faint leads that might confirm what they both suspected. The town's whispers had grown sharper. Some people encouraged them to press on, others muttered about stirring trouble with men who held money and influence. Jack stayed steady, balancing caution with duty, knowing from his days in uniform that facts, not opinions, would decide the path ahead. One morning, Mike showed up with an envelope of photographs taken from a camera mounted on the edge of his property. He had angled it toward the road leading past the bluff, not expecting much, but one shot captured a white van moving near the old warehouse at a suspicious hour. Jack printed the photo at the library, where the attendant eyed it nervously before slipping it across the counter without comment. Later that day, they visited Mabel Ortiz at the bait shop, whose own security camera pointed toward Harbor Street. She hesitated before opening her files, but finally copied footage onto a flash drive showing the same van idling by the loading docks on the night Jack had first found the dogs. The evidence began to stack like bricks. Next came the harder work. Jack and Mike returned to the warehouse during daylight with gloves, swabs, and a notebook. They found a smear of dried blood on the concrete floor beneath a stack of pallets, a strip of chain with rust at the edges, but a fresher stain near the hook and a receipt crumpled under an overturned bucket. The paper, though damp, revealed a recent purchase from a local feed supplier, several bulk orders of animal-grade chemical cleaner, and large bags of low-quality feed. Jack copied the invoice number, and Mike noted the buyer's name printed faintly at the bottom, Richard Kane. Kane was not an unknown figure. He ran an auto yard near the edge of town and owned several rental properties. People described him as practical and ruthless, the kind of man who knew how to stretch a dollar and how to make problems disappear. Jack carried the evidence to Emily Hartman at the clinic. She studied the blood sample under proper light and confirmed it matched canine origin consistent with injuries like those on Max Shadow and Bear. She encouraged Jack to proceed carefully, promising to document her findings with professional signatures should the matter reach authorities. Armed with receipts, photographs, and testimony, Jack and Mike decided the time had come to confront Kane directly. They found him at his auto yard, leaning against a truck with grease staining his hands. He looked up with narrowed eyes as they approached, recognizing neither friendliness nor fear in their posture. Jack spoke first, presenting the receipt and the photo, laying them on a nearby workbench without accusation, but with clarity. Kane chuckled dryly, dismissing the evidence as coincidence. He claimed the van was a rental used by many, the receipt a routine purchase for maintaining his yard, the blood an unfortunate stain from scrap metal accidents. His voice carried the confidence of someone used to winning arguments through power, not truth. Yet as he spoke, he shifted unconsciously. When Mike mentioned the dogs by description, the shepherd with foam at his mouth, the Doberman trembling, the Rottweiler weakened, Kane interrupted with a phrase that stilled the air. He muttered, "That big one with the amber eyes was always too stubborn to break." The words fell heavy, unintended, yet unmistakable. Jack's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the notebook at his side. Only someone who had seen Bear up close could have known the color of his eyes or the difficulty of breaking his will. Mike glanced at Jack, both men silently registering the slip. Kane realized too late what he had said. He tried to backtrack, claiming he had heard rumors around town, but the damage was done. Jack calmly told him that he would bring the findings to authorities, and that Kane's denial would be weighed against his own words. Kane's smile faded into a grim line, and he warned them not to push their luck. Jack did not answer with threats. He gathered the papers, nodded once, and walked away with Mike and the dogs, leaving Kane staring after them, unease flickering behind his practiced confidence. That night, Jack sat at his table under the dim lamplight, writing a detailed report with times, dates, and direct quotes. Max lay near the door, shadow curled under the chair, Bear resting his head on Jack's boots. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, carrying with it the knowledge that the line had been crossed. He no longer wondered if the cruelty was real, no longer questioned whether the dogs had belonged to someone indifferent. He knew the truth now. They had been discarded property from a man with power, and that man had revealed his hand. The path ahead would demand not only courage, but allies who could stand against Kane's influence. The slip of Richard Kane's tongue carried further than he expected. Jack Turner, with Mike Harris at his side, brought their evidence to Sheriff Donnelly, a man known more for his patience than his speed, but whose sense of justice had not dulled with age. At first the sheriff hesitated, weighing the power Kane held in property and money, but the photographs, the receipts, and the veterinarian's professional notes stacked too high to ignore. Donnelly nodded once, his jaw set, and promised to move carefully but firmly. Within days, a warrant was signed. The raid was scheduled quietly at dawn, when most of the town still slept under the gray veil of morning fog. Jack did not go with them, though every part of him wanted to. He stayed behind with the dogs, pacing the porch as unmarked trucks rolled toward the warehouse. Hours stretched thin until word finally reached him. Dozens of animals were pulled from the building, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies thin and scarred. Cages lined the walls, chains coiled like forgotten whips, and a ledger was found on a desk in Kane's office, each page documenting transactions with dates, breeds, and amounts that turned life into numbers. The scale of cruelty staggered even the officers hardened by years of service. What Jack had seen with 3 dogs was only the edge of a far larger wound. News spread quickly through town. Some neighbors avoided Jack's eyes, unwilling to be connected to the storm, but others brought blankets, food, and offers of foster homes. Dr. Collins and her staff worked without rest, treating the rescued animals. Mike built temporary pens from salvaged wood and wire, his hands steady, his voice low, teaching volunteers how to approach dogs who did not yet know trust. Jack moved among them quietly, guiding, lifting, cleaning, his presence as constant as the tide. In those days, the cabin became more than a home. It became a rallying point. Kane, meanwhile, was arrested and charged. His lawyer argued fiercely that the warehouse was not under his use, that the receipts were misinterpreted, that coincidence had been mistaken for guilt. Yet the ledger, the chemicals, the van, and his own careless words painted a darker picture. The case went to court, and the small county courthouse filled with townspeople, reporters, and officials drawn by the scale of what had been uncovered. Jack was called to the stand. He wore a plain shirt, his posture steady, the scars on his hands visible but unremarked. He spoke calmly, not as a man seeking revenge, but as one recounting a duty fulfilled. He described the morning he found Max Shadow and Bear in the roadside bags, the weight of their bodies, the smell of chemicals, the silence broken only by shallow breaths. He told of carrying each one, of driving with the heater blasting, of pressing his hand against Bear's chest as life flickered thin. He spoke of nights when nightmares clawed back, and of Max lying across his chest, anchoring him to the present. He did not embellish, did not raise his voice. He told it as it happened, and the room leaned into the quiet truth of it. When Kane's lawyer pressed him, asking why he had involved himself when others might have turned away, Jack answered simply, "Because no one gets left behind." The words held no theatrics, only the weight of lived oath. Murmurs stirred among the crowd, not of spectacle, but of recognition. The prosecutor presented the photographs, the receipts, the video stills, and Dr. Collins testified about the injuries matching the tools found in the warehouse. Each piece clicked into place like parts of a rifle assembled in the field. Kane sat stiff, his jaw tight, but his earlier slip about Bear's amber eyes returned in testimony, a detail only possible from direct knowledge. The jury listened, faces drawn with grim understanding. After deliberation, the verdict came swift guilty on multiple counts of animal cruelty, illegal operation, and conspiracy. Kane's wealth and property could not shield him. As the judge read the sentence, the weight of the courtroom shifted. Justice had not erased the suffering, but it had named it, acknowledged it, and punished it. Jack left the courthouse with Mike at his side and the dogs waiting in the truck. Reporters called out, but Jack said little. He opened the door, let Max jump into the cab, watched Shadow climb carefully, and lifted Bear onto the seat. He sat behind the wheel, exhaled, and felt something release, not triumph, but the heavy knot of a battle fought and settled. Yet he knew the story did not end with one conviction. The rescued animals still needed homes, healing, and hope, and the town, now awake to what had been hidden, would decide whether to step forward or step back. The courthouse verdict did not mark an end, but a threshold. In the weeks that followed, Jack Turner continued his routine with Max, Shadow, and Bear, yet the world around him shifted. Where once his cabin had stood as a solitary place on the bluff, it now drew visitors. Volunteers who had helped during the raid came by to deliver supplies. Townsfolk stopped to ask about the rescued animals, and children left folded notes on his porch railing. Jack accepted the kindness with quiet nods, focusing each day on the steady rhythm of care bowls of clean water, measured doses of medicine, calm words that anchored nervous animals to the present. Mike Harris remained close, lending his knowledge and his steady presence. Together they built pens from sturdy fencing, cleared brush to make a training yard, and created shaded areas where dogs could rest without fear. Dr. Collins stopped by, often checking health and progress, her practiced hands guiding both men in their new role as guardians of more than just 3 dogs. One afternoon, as Jack repaired the porch steps, a pair of visitors arrived in a sedan marked with the logo of a National Animal Welfare Foundation. They introduced themselves as representatives who had followed the case in court and had seen reports of his work. They explained that their organization supported sanctuaries across the country, places where abused animals could find safety and people could learn about compassion. They had a proposal to partner with Jack and transform his cabin and surrounding land into an official shelter funded and supported, named to honor what he had begun. Jack listened carefully, his hands resting on the worn railing, his eyes steady. He asked about the logistics, about how to ensure the dog's well-being, about what commitment it would require of him. The answers came practical and clear, but the heart of the offer was simple. They wanted his place to become a harbor, a safe haven not just for Max, Shadow, and Bear, but for many others still waiting for rescue. At first, Jack hesitated. He had built this life quietly, not seeking attention, and the thought of opening his home to constant visitors pressed against his natural reserve. Yet, he looked at Max, watching the tree line with calm vigilance. Shadow learning to step into sunlight without trembling. Bear lifting his head with strength returned, and he knew the story could not stop with just them. He agreed. Plans moved swiftly. Volunteers came with lumber, paint, and tools. The fishermen built kennels sturdy as boats, the diner owner brought meals for workers, and children painted signs with paw prints and hopeful names. Mike oversaw the training yard, showing teenagers how to guide a nervous dog with patience instead of force. Jack worked each day until his hands ached, but each ache felt purposeful, a continuation of the promise he had made on the roadside. The day of the opening dawned bright, the fog lifting early as if the coastline itself understood the weight of the occasion. Cars lined the road below the bluff, and townsfolk gathered along the fence. The foundation unveiled the sign, Harbor of Hope. Jack stood beside Mike Dr. Collins and the volunteers, his shirt plain, his posture steady, not for ceremony, but for the dogs. When the ribbon was cut, the gates opened. Max bounded forward first, tail high, his stride confident. Shadow followed hesitant at the crowd, then breaking into a run, her sleek body shining under the sun. Bear lumbered behind, powerful yet gentle, his bark carrying across the field like a declaration of survival. The three of them ran together, circling, leaping free in a way they had never been when Jack first found them. The crowd cheered, children clapped, and even the sheriff wiped a hand across his face. Jack watched quietly, his hands resting on the fence rail, his throat tight with something heavier than pride. He leaned down, spoke softly to himself and to the memory of those he had carried in war and in peace. "No one left behind," he whispered. The words were not loud, but they were steady, the same oath that had followed him across oceans and deserts, now spoken on American soil beside dogs who had taught him that loyalty did not end with uniforms. As the sun lowered, families toured the pens, volunteers guided them, and the foundation representatives spoke of future plans, veterinary services, on-site adoption programs, education for schools. Jack let the details pass around him. He stayed near the dogs, greeting each one rescued, offering his presence as assurance. Mike stood beside him, their silence companionable, both men knowing that healing was not an endpoint, but a road walked together. When the last visitors departed and the evening quiet returned, Jack sat on the porch with Max at his side, Shadow leaning against his knee, Bear resting his head on his boots. The cabin no longer felt like isolation. It felt like purpose. The sea below rolled steady against the rocks. The harbor lights flickered on, and Jack closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to hold the peace that had taken root. The Harbor of Hope was no monument. It was a living place, shaped by scars and sustained by loyalty. And for Jack Turner, it was proof that redemption could be built not only for men, but for every living soul once abandoned, reminding him with each breath that the truest battles are not won alone. 3 dogs, 1 Marine, and a town divided, that was the road to the Harbor of Hope. If you were in Jack's place, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to like and subscribe to follow more powerful stories like this one.